Hey everyone, welcome to Joshi's Journey episode 2 into 40k and my drive to be a top 100 player on the ITC ladder. If I sound different to you, that's because I am sick. I've been dealing with a head cold all day and I have a bit of a cough, so I'm going to try and do this one relatively quickly and get through a lot of things relatively fast so that I can do it in one take. And it's probably going to be a little bit lower quality, but I'm trying to do this as much for myself as I am for all of you guys. So let's go ahead and get started. So today, you guys, we're going to be talking about the Gameology RTT in April, Bolter and Taxes, as it has been called, and how I did at that one. If you remember last time, the previous event that I went to, Game Ogre, actually took first out of 15 players. And this one is going to be a very different kind of event. But before we actually start talking about the lay of the land and how everything looks, let's go ahead and talk about the list that I brought. If you watch the previous episode, there's not going to be a whole lot of changes that actually took place between the last list and this one. So we're going to get through this one relatively quickly. Firstly, in the HQ slots, I took the same 3 HQ choices, the Cadian Command Squad with the Finial. Even with the recent balance data slate nerfs, this is still very good, especially on the ITC terrain that is dominating the west coast of the United States, because there's not a whole lot of dents. There are some units that do have a -1 to hit, but the kind of units that you're really going to be hitting with the mortars don't have those all that much unless they want to burn CP to make it happen. So the Finial nerf's not that big of a difference, and it can really help against any units with phase gap still. After that, we took Lord Solar Leontus with the Warlord trait to refund command points on a 5+ up to maximum of 1 per battle round. This guy actually did a lot of work this tournament. We'll talk about that a little bit later. My last HQ choice was again a tank commander with Gatekeeper, the super battle cannon, Lasgun on the front, heavy bolters on the sides, and no warlord traits or anything else beyond that. For troops, this is one of the places that we do have a difference. We took 5 squads of Cadian shock troops with Plasma Melta, Autogun, and a Vox. One of the very few changes that we did make, you will notice I dropped the Primaris Psyker this time around. For elites, we actually still took 2 units of Kazarkin even after the balanced data slate, which made overcharged las cells have a maximum of 6 mortal wounds per phase that you activate the stratagem in, instead of 6 per unit that you're targeting with. So what we did do is we rekitted the Kazarkin. They're not taking volley guns and plasma, or just one with volley guns and the rest las guns. They both have 2 plasmas, 2 meltas, and a Vox. One of the unit has veteran guerrillas to ignore cover at 18 inches or less, and the other one has heirloom weapons for plus 4-inch range. In the fast attack, we have the same bit of experiment that we ran in the last event: 3 sentinels with flamers and chainsaws, a unit of 1 sentinel with just a plasma, and then 1 other unit of sentinel with a plasma as well. I really like the Flamer Chainsaw experiment from the previous event, and we'll talk more about how well they performed in today's event as well. Heavy support, we are continuing our journey with the mortars. Even though they're not my favorite unit in the world, they're not super interesting to bring. They are so good into a lot of the armies that I was expecting to play against today. There were a lot of Eldar players who were coming, and some Tau players, and realistically, mortars are shredding both of those armies apart. With the Gene Stealers also on the table, there was a lot of different things that the mortars were really good into. And so today we chose to keep them in, even with the changes to the Finial. They didn't get changed all that much, if we're entirely honest. Next, we have 2 units of 1 Lehman Russ battle tank each with Executioner, one of them with Flamers all around, the other one with heavy bolters on the sides and a Lascannon on the front. Our last heavy support slot is, again, the exact same Rogal Dorn battle tank with heavy stubbers, heavy bolters, the pulverizer cannon, and the oppressor cannon with coaxial autocannon on top. We're continuing to take Vaunted Praetorian because of the flexibility that it gives us, because you can move it around the map, you can use it in isolation, you can team it up with other tanks. It's still just a very strong tank ace, and I will take this probably every time I have a Rogal Dorn. Lastly, in no force organization slot, we did take a Commissar, but instead of the power sword that we gave him last time, we were less lazy. We slashed off that power sword in order to, plus the 60 points from dropping a primary psyker, pick up an extra squad of regular lads. And so just a bare bones Commissar that we took this time around. Now, time to get into the lay of the land, and we have to preface this by saying, well, Game Ogre was a relatively casual event that was a lot of fun to go to, and while there were a lot of players there who had some tournament experience, this event here for Gameology RTT was a crazy Shark Tank. There were 2 players in the top 10 global ITC ladders, in Jason McKenzie and Kyle Perry. There were an additional 4 in the top 100. There are an additional 11 in the top 1,000, meaning that of the 33 players that actually came to this event, 17 were rated top 1,000. That is more than half. Only 4 players didn't have an ITC rank, meaning that this was their first event. On top of that, we had 10 people listing the Xenos Petting Zoo as their club. And if you're not familiar with what that is, and I'll be honest, I don't know a ton about it, my understanding is this is a Discord and a team of some of the strongest players that we have on the West Coast here for 40K. 10 of them showed up, multiple of them in the top 10, multiple of them in the top 100. These guys are very, very good overall. Now, I do want to give a bit of a disclaimer as well. I've been talking a lot about what ITC rankings are, but I haven't really gone into what those are. It is worth noting that rankings below about the top 1,000, maybe top 1,500, anything beyond that, are mostly based on how many events you've actually participated in. As an easy example, my ranking jumped from about 4,800 after my first event that I went to last month to about 1,300 once we added the Game Ogre event that I went to. And that's partly a reflection that I did well at my second event, but also just the fact that I've gone to 2 events puts me well above everybody who's just gone to 1 event. So with that, let's start talking about all of the different games that we had today. Game 1 went up against Mark Farrick and his Tau. And to give a brief overview of what his list was, he had the big Crisis Suit blob with shield drones, all the plasma, and the cyclic ion cannons, you know the drill. But he also brought Long Strike's Hammerhead, a Sky Ray, a unit of broadsides, now that they do have core again after the balanced data slate, smattering of Fire Warriors and Kroot Hounds, Commander Shadow Sun, a commander in a Crisis Battle Suit, and Aun Va, the big ethereal that gives you a lot of access to a lot of buffing opportunities throughout the rest of the army. We were playing on Tide of Conviction, the one where you have 4 in No Man's Land, you have 1 in each of your own, and it's the long edge table deploy. It is a control 2, control 3, control more than your opponent in order to score for primary, and the tertiary is controlling any objective on your opponent's side of the battlefield. For secondaries, I took Inflexible Command, Boots on the Ground, and Raise the Banners High, and Mark took Decisive Action, Bring It Down, and Aerospace Targeting Relays. For Decisive Action, that's the one where, based on if you're going Mont Ka or Kao Yan, you need to control half or more of the objectives on the field in order to score 4 points per turn. Bring It Down, we've all talked about that. And Aerospace Targeting Relays is another Tau specialty where you place a marker halfway between every battle edge. And you need infantry within 6 inches to do an action there. And you get points based on how many of them you've actually completed. So, with this one, with the long edges, it is worth noting that Mark did bring a couple of redeploys around to this one, and so that actually helped him out a fair amount with his ability to take his Skyray off the table after seeing that he was not going to be getting first turn to guarantee that the Skyray would actually have some opportunity to be aggressive. And this is, I'll be honest, guys, the games today, games 1 and 2, were kind of non-games. And this one starts off with me getting turn 1. I go first, and we gotta say, the Sentinel with the Flamers and Chainsaws once again did a ton of work. So, starts off, Mark leaves his Devilfish out in the open, on his own home objective. I use my Rogel Dorn and the Executioners to annihilate the Devilfish, and basically just the Oppressor Cannon and then the Executioner Cannon after that, killing the Devilfish and the Fire Warriors inside, and then the few that were left were picked up by Flamers coming from the Sentinels as well. But that wasn't the big deal, right? We kind of expected that to happen. I'm sure that Mark also expected the Devilfish to not be able to survive turn 1. In fact, it's probably just a bait in order to bring my Rogel Dorn out into the open so that he could shoot it with Long Strike. But the thing that did really matter is my Sentinels, by starting off in No Man's Land, they march forward, they get into my opponent's deployment zone, and they do a couple of crucial things. One, they clear out the last of the Fire Warriors, the only units they had left on his home objective. And on Tides of Conviction, if you don't hold your home objective, you have to roll a die. On a 4+, you still get your CP at the top of every turn. But on a 1 through 3, you don't get the CP. So, cleared off that. So, Mark is going to have to start rolling for his CP every turn that he's not controlling this objective. Secondly, the Sentinels make I believe it was a 6-inch charge into Aun Va. And this was devastating. So it starts off, the Sentinels are actually charging in. They get into Aun Va. They have 9 attacks, strength 6, hitting on 4s, AP 2, damage 2. They run in. I roll pretty well. I actually hit 6 of the 9 attacks on a 4-up. And then I get every single one of those hits to convert into a wound. Now, it is worth noting at this point, I did look it up later. I don't know if Mark remembered that Alan Vaugh's unit has a -1 to wound, meaning I would only be wounding on 3s, and we both thought, I think, that we were wounding on 2s. So, whether or not that would have been enough to actually keep Alan Vaughn up is a very different question. But, as it was, Mark had 6 5-up invuls to try and make. And crucially, he fails all but one. That is 5 attacks doing 2 damage each that he first puts on Alan Vaugh's guards. They both have 2 wounds. They're dead. And then the other 3 are exactly enough to kill Alan Vaughn. And I asked Mark later on in the game, like, hey, how important was killing Alan Vaughn to, like, limiting your ability to play? And he said, at the time, it's annoying, but it wasn't that big of a deal. And looking back, I actually think it was a lot bigger of a deal than he maybe gave it credit for, because Alan Vaughn, every turn on a 2+, generates an extra command point for his army. And because I took him off of his objective, and he ends up rolling fairly poorly on trying to generate the CP when he's not holding his objective, realistically, I think I probably cost Mark somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 command points over the course of the game. And this will come up a little bit later on, but Mark only ever used Fire and Fade, the move, shoot, move on his crisis suits, once the entire game because he didn't have the command points for it. And that's crazy. The fact that they now have to commit to everything that they're trying to do suddenly means that Mark's crisis suits are way less safe. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get further. So that was the first crucial moment of the game. The second crucial moment on Mark's turn 1 comes around when, after I've revealed my Rogel Dorn in order to clean up his Devilfish and the Fire Warriors, Long Strike, the tank ace of the Tau, comes out on the side. He has his railgun aimed at the Rogel Dorn. And we have to remember that the Rogel Dorn, excuse me, not the Rogel Dorn, the railgun is an actually crazy weapon. Because Mark took Tau Sept, he gets to reroll 1 hit or wound per phase per unit. And also, Longstrike has an inbuilt elite sharpshooters for any guard players reroll to hit. So he gets to reroll the railgun to hit. He also gets to reroll it to wound. And so he throws it out. He's hitting on a 3. Okay. He rolls his first die. He rolls a 1. All right, that's fine. Longstrike gets to reroll that. This time he gets it. He hits it on a 3. Next, he has to wound because it is strength, I believe 14. It is wounding the Rogel Dorn on a 3. He rolls it, gets a 2. He uses his Tau Sept reroll on it as well, rolls a 1. And because of that, my Rogel Dorn, at minimum, was going to be taking 10 damage from the single railgun shot that it now just didn't, right? I mean, I wouldn't have had an invul. I didn't have anything that was going to be able to save it. It would have punched right through the armor and absolutely have devastated the Rogel Dorn, taking it down from the top bracket to the middle bracket instantly. But he missed. And on my next turn, my Rogel Dorn turned its cannon. I kind of get like a moment from like Hell Let Loose or World of Tanks, where you start taking fire and you're thinking, what is shooting me? Where are they shooting me from? But as the Rogel Dorn, as my turn comes around, it turns its main cannon to like a long strike, and it blows it off the table instantly because of how well the Oppressor Cannon actually deals with almost every like light to medium vehicle, right? Most medium vehicles will not be able to stand up to the Rogel Dorn, and Long Strike was no different. So Alan Va was dead on turn 1. Long Strike was dead on turn 2. And while Mark had used his Crisis Suit Blob to move up into the middle of the board on his first turn, he did some damage to a couple of different units. He cleaned up a bunch of my Sentinels. The Crisis Suits were now vulnerable to my strategic reserves because I had left an Executioner and the Tank Commander in reserves. I bring them off on the side, and I believe I peel off all but one of the shield drones off of that unit. And there are 6 shield drones. That is a lot of 4-ups invul saves that I have to get through. But with the amount of like crushing firepower that comes through, the crisis suits are now very vulnerable to future fire, and also if they don't have access to command points because they don't have fire and fade, they have to commit to every decision they actually want to make. On turn 2, I also deploy some strategic reserves off to the far left side of the board in order to try and deny his ability to deploy fire warriors to do the aerospace targeting relays. And because of that, I don't think that it had a huge impact on the game, but it did delay his ability to throw down more infantry there. They couldn't come in on the right side either because that's where my tanks had come in. So aerospace targeting relay very quickly became very difficult for Mark to score. On Mark's turn 2, he's able to get his commander in the crisis battle suit up, and between that, his Skyray, and his broadside team, they do up a lot of damage. They actually take down, I believe, all three of my Lehman Russes on turn 2. And I'm only really left with the Rogel Dorn, but being only left with the Rogel Dorn is still like a crazy single unit to have available. And on turn 3, I actually have Lord Solar charges and kills his commander in a crisis battle suit, or a crisis battle suit. And then my mortars start shooting out, and they pound the last of his fire warriors. His crisis suits die to the Rogel Dorn, and realistically, he doesn't have enough infantry left on the table to actually move around and get the rest of his aerospace targeting relays. And at that point, as Mark cleans up the last of my vehicles for Bring It Down and decisive action kicks in, we decide to call the game. We end up finishing about 45 minutes early based on the round timer, and he's able to get a lot of points off of decisive action because his crew hounds are able to run up, they're able to control a lot of different objectives, so he's able to max out decisive action, but he only gets 2 of the different aerospace relays, meaning that that's only going to be 6 of the possible 15 points because he was not able to get any infantry towards the point in my deployment zone or the one on the right side, or my right side of the board. And after all of that, the game, I mean, it felt kind of like a non-game because he didn't have any CP. The one thing that he really needed to do with long strike hitting and then following it up with like broadsides to kill the Rogel Dorn didn't happen until way too late in the game, right? The broadsides did eventually bring down the Rogel Dorn, but that was turn 3, turn 4 that we were saying that it actually happened, and it just got off 3, 4 rounds of shooting before that, and that is way too much shooting for a Rogel Dorn to be able to still have across the course of a game. So at the very end of the day, game 1, we do end up taking that one away with a score of 88-62. The only secondary I didn't max out was boots on the ground because I probably could have been a little bit more aggressive with some of my infantry in order to score more boots points, especially on turn 3, when I was no longer worried about whether or not I could max out in flexible command. But still, 88-62 does get me the win in game 1 up against the highest ranked opponent I actually played against. Mark was ranked 329 going into this event, and honestly, he was a pretty good player. He actually challenged me at the beginning for every wound of models that were destroyed, to do squats. And I think he did that against all of his opponents. I don't know if everybody else did it, but I did my best to keep up with it. I ended up doing something in the neighborhood of like 60 to 70 squats. But anyway, that was game 1. Game 2, played up against Kyle, who on the ITC website lists his name as Kyle, quote unquote, Cornhub. And he brought his Chaos Space Marines today. And it was a very different style of list from what you might be expecting. So we'll start off with the more expected things. He had a Lord Discordant on the tail thing, the giant scorpion thing, a Warpsmith, a single squad of cultists, a squad of legionaries, a Trader Guard squad, 3 Decimators, which I had never seen before, but they're kind of like dreadnoughts that have mortal wounding bombs, basically. A squad of Raptors, 2 Venom Crawlers as well. And the part that y'all might be excited about, he brought Vashtor the Arcaphane and a Greater Brass Scorpion. Let me say that again. He brought a Greater Brass Scorpion to the table. It's one of these giant things. You know, it's skittering around. It is absolutely massive. It's almost as much points as a Baneblade, right? He just drops a super heavy on the table. And Honestly, I had no idea what it did, but apparently it shoots super well. It's a crazy melee threat if it can actually get in, and it has a 3d6 charge, right? While it still does have to target something within 12 inches, you are virtually guaranteeing, right? You're going to be looking at a 10.5 average for the charge. Most of the time, you're going to get that maximum 12-inch charge, and that is crazy. But let's actually talk about the mission that we played. This one was Data Scry Salvage, corners deployment with four objectives across the middle of the board. And the tertiary objective is if you have something doing an action on your home objective, you get 1 point up to a maximum of 3 per objective that you are controlling at the end of your turn. For secondaries, I took Inflexible Command, Boots on the Ground, and Bring It Down. And Bring It Down is one of the ones where if you just kill everything, that's a vehicle on your opponent's side of the board. Kyle said that if I killed all of his vehicles, I would max out at exactly 15. So I took that one. Kyle took the Long War, which is a Chaos Space Marine one, whereby you uh, get points by taking objectives from your opponents and shooting things off of objectives. Bring it down and retrieve battlefield data. It is worth noting that on this table, the terrain was really light, actually. We each had 2 pieces of obscuring runes, 2 crate obstacles, kind of like the longer ones, but we each had like 1 larger crate and 1 smaller crate. And then we both had a piece of dents, right? Like, it was an incredibly low terrain board. And so what that meant in particular was that guard love playing on low terrain boards. We are so good at shooting things across the just like open lines of fire. Whereas Chaos Space Marines, you like it really depends on what kind of list. Most of the time they don't really like it. But as we set up, Kyle knew that in order for him to have a chance at winning this game, he would need to deploy to go first. And so he drops his Brass Scorpion right in the middle of the table with this giant like lane from which he can just like run down the center and hopefully get a turn 1 charge off. But then we rolled to see who goes first, and I won the roll off. And again, I gotta admit, you guys, this game was also kind of a non-game. I set up my tank commander, my Rogel Dorn, and an executioner as far back in my deployment zone as possible because of the relatively short range that Kyle's army had. I think the longest range he had on any of his weapons was like 36 inches. Like maybe a couple of things, like 1 or 2 things were 48 inches. But if I put them all the way back, there was nothing that was going to be able to shoot them on turn 1, even if they were completely exposed. But that also means that between things like Full Throttle and Lord Solar rerolls and Gunner's Kill on sight, all 3 of my tanks could move forward, and on turn 1, all 3 of the tanks just poured all of their shots into the Brass Scorpion, and it dies. And I don't even think I rolled particularly well. I just had so much shooting with which to take it down, and the game basically ended on the spot. Honestly, he really needed to go first. He really needed to get the Brass Scorpion into my lines for the charge threat and also just the amount of damage that it can do in close combat with like strength 8 flamers, a battle cannon, like a chain gun that has on top, and none of that got brought to bear. So he's just down 430 points on turn 1 in exchange for about 6 to 700 points of my shooting at the single target. But let's be real, guys. That's a trade you will make every single time. Um, for the rest of the game, we didn't have a whole lot of interesting things, but I will talk about the few interesting moments that did happen because every single time he would put like cultists or the trader guardsman on his home objective to do the data intercept, the data scry salvage tertiary, mortars would shoot them off. They're very squishy, right? I have a lot of mortars. I have 3x3 units of mortars that I specifically made sure were going to be in range of anything that was on that home objective, and they consistently died. Um, so let's talk about the couple of interesting things that did actually happen. On turn 2, Vashtor gets into my tanks, and I didn't realize like how good Vashtor actually was in melee versus vehicles. He does like a ton of mortal wounds every single time he hits things, and so he does blow up, I believe it was my tank commander on turn 2. But immediately afterwards, I charge him with Lord Solar Leontus, and over the course of 2 turns of fighting, do actually manage to kill him. Other interesting thing on turn 2, with the change to the overcharged las cells, the Kazarkin bomb is nowhere near as good at just like killing tons of things, but it is really good at killing one thing super dead. And on turn two, I took my Kazarkin from the back of my deployment zone and teleported them right to the front of my deployment zone. And they were able to blow up the Disco Lord using Lord Solar's rerolls and the overcharged Lascell's stratagem. And by killing the Disco Lord, that was also like running towards my lines. He's very just rapidly running out of melee threats. And on turn three, I actually gave the Kazarkin fixed bayonets. Let's go, charging guard, and they were able to kill the few legionaries that were left after I bombarded them with some mortars. The only other interesting thing that really happened this game on turn three, Kyle misordered some of his shooting activations, and one of his decimators kills a Lehman Russ. But if you're not familiar, the guard has a stratagem called Vengeful Salute, whereby uh, for 1 CP, your tank can shoot its turret weapon on death. And as long as it doesn't explode, it shoots and it hits on a 4. Okay, so it's like effectively being on its second bracket. And the Raptors that had just come down on turn 3, they were getting ready to charge off of one of the objectives in No Man's Land, died instantly before they had a chance to do anything. And that was really funny to me, probably less funny to Kyle, but overall, I felt a little bit bad for Kyle because it was swelteringly hot in the venue, and when you're kind of just getting shot off the board, like not interactively, it was. I didn't have a ton of fun other than the fact that I was winning this game, and I know that Kyle was having a bit of a rough time. So, funny to me, not a great moment for Kyle, but the end of the game was 95 to 51. I maxed out Inflexible Command and Bring It Down and got 12 points on Boots on the Ground, and I got very close to maxing out on Primary. But it's really hard to max Primary on Data Spry Salvage for Guard because we don't love actually having to move units into the middle of the board. On the other hand, Kyle just kind of ran out of things. He only ever got or two retrieve battlefield datas off, and like he killed most of my vehicles, but not all of them. So I was left with a Lehman Russ and a Rogel Thorn at the end of the game, and the Long War, like he did good while he had units still on the field to control the battlefield, but I mean on turn 5 he was completely off the table. He had nothing left. So ultimately, game 2, not the most interesting thing in the world. It really was like who ended up going first just because of the lack of terrain and the nature of our two armies. So felt a little bit bad, but such is life, such as going to a Warhammer tournament. That does take us to 2-0. Our last game of the day, I know I said this was going to be a relatively fast recording, a relatively short video, partly because, again, guys, I'm sick. I've honestly coughed a lot less than I was kind of expecting to, but even just trying to get through this with this pounding headache has been not the most pleasant thing in the world. And game 3, I played up against Kevin and his Dark Angels, and I will say that this was my favorite game of the day. And let's talk about why. So, to start off with, the mission that we were playing was Secure Missing Artifacts. Okay? We're doing this in a little bit of a different order, you might have noticed. I took Boots on the Ground, Inflexible Command, and Retrieve Battlefield Data. Kevin took Oaths of Moment, which is a Space Marine special objective whereby you can, as long as you like aren't retreating and killing vehicles, you're going to get a maximum on this almost every single time. Took Warp Ritual and Stubborn Defiance. Stubborn Defiance is an interesting Space Marine objective where you pick one objective on the battlefield at the beginning of the game, and for every consecutive turn that you control that at the end of your command phase, you will get an equal number of points to the battle round. So if you control it for all 5 turns consecutively, you get 15 points. But if you only control it for 4 turns, you can max out at 10, because if you don't have it in the 5th battle round, that is 10. That is 5 points missing because of the 5th battle round. And if you've played against Dark Angels before, you will recognize a lot of the things that were in Kevin's list. But with a couple of changes from the balanced data slate, the Deathwing did lose Transhuman across the board. We'll talk about what he did have. Captain in Phobos armor, Chaplain in Terminator armor, a Librarian in Phobos armor, Primaris Lieutenant, Deathwing Ancient with the Pennant of Remembrance, and then you had a Deathwing Command Squad, a Deathwing Terminator Squad, regular Terminator Squad, and then you had a Desolation Squad, the indirect Rocket Launcher Marines, and interestingly enough, he had asked the TO beforehand if he was allowed to bring the Lion. And he was allowed to. They ended up bringing the Lion out to the actual game, and for 320 points, he was saying that it actually had done almost nothing for him all day. But in the interest of brevity, let's go ahead and talk about the few interesting moments that happened this game and kind of my battle plan going in. I realized that uh, if both of us kind of did nothing, I would end up losing on primary, or at least I thought I would, because I'd only be controlling 2 objectives, whereas Kevin would be controlling 3, meaning that I get 8, 8, 8, 8 if I control both of mine, and he will get 12, 12, 12, 12, maxing out. But what I hadn't taken in consideration was the tertiary objective, where at the beginning of the game, you select your opponent's objective that they need to score, and if you control it at the end of your turn, it's worth 3 points. And so, if I had recognized that, if I had just held my 2 objectives and gotten all 5 turns of my tertiary objective, I actually max out on primary. But even still, if we both do nothing all game other than like deploy units in order to get like retrieve battlefield data and like do warp rituals, I will end up losing by a couple of points because it's very, very hard to consistently max out boots on the ground. It's very typically going to be somewhere between like 8 and 12 points if you're having a pretty good game. But if you're getting blasted, you end up losing a lot more than that. And so I thought that I needed to smash on primary. But this was the wrong battle plan because, as we kind of touched on before, Stubborn Defiance, if I could have stopped him for a single turn for controlling the middle objective by throwing something with objective secured onto it, because all of his guys are elite, they don't have objective secured. Whereas I can give Sentinels, I can give move, move, move to regular guys. I can drop something with objective secured on the middle objective for a single turn. And that will win, right? I was already looking at a 97 to 94 loss. If he loses that 5 points, I'm looking at a 94 to 92 win. But I didn't recognize that. And so I thought I needed to split the board up and make him move off the center objective just naturally. And so because of this, on turn 1, I started with 3 tanks on the board, and he actually shot one of them off with his Desolation Marines. He also shot the 1 unit of infantry that could actually run up to the middle objective and take him off of it consistently. So I was down a Lehman Russ, and I had to spend 2 CP to have it shoot back. I spent 1 on Vengeful Salute, and I spent another 1 to reroll the number of shots. And it only killed like 3 Desolation Marines. Like, even though that's killing close to 100 points of models, it is not worth it for 2 CP and the Lehman Russ altogether. I should have kept this Lehman Russ off the table. But the 2 interesting moments that happened all game. On turn 1, I used my Barbican's Key Kazarkin and my mortars to take his servitors off the battlefield. They were currently sitting on his home objective. I smashed them with the mortars. I used my Rogel Dorn and Tank Commander to blast a squad of Desolation Marines. And so suddenly, the 2 characters, and I don't remember exactly which ones they were, but the 2 characters that he had sitting on his home objective were no longer benefiting from Lookout Serve from anyone, because you need units of 3 models or more, or a vehicle next to them in order to make sure that they cannot be shot. And so, my Kazarkin jumped in. I spent the 1 CP on overcharged las cells, but I didn't spend the CP on ingrained precision, but I still mortal wound bombed one of the 2 characters. And then I shot the Meltas and the Plasmas into the other character, leaving it on 1 wound. And at this point, I'm like, alright, well, these Kazarkin are dead, kind of no matter what. We'll see if we can make a 10-inch charge. And I roll it, and I roll a 10. And my Kazarkin, because they still have the Lord Solar's rerolls, which last until the beginning of my next command phase, they charge in. They go through, and even though he spends a CP so that everything outside of the first rank is no longer able to fight, they chop that other character down, and my Kazarkin are able to control his backline objective for a turn. Now, This doesn't do a ton in terms of like actually preventing him from scoring points, but what it does do is it does allow, or it does require Kevin to turn around with a bunch of his Terminators to go and take me off of his home objective. And so he had to leave with his 10-man squad of Deathwing Terminators with Thunderhammers and Storm Shields to get into his own backfield, and they ended up not doing a whole lot else throughout the course of the rest of the game, but they didn't need to. On turn two, the other important part of the game happened, and this was a bit of a knowledge gap for me. I did not know that for 1 CP, he could give a 2-inch aura to charges around one of his characters. And when it deep striked into the middle of the board, I was okay with letting him try and make 9-inch charges because a single one, a 9-inch charge is about like a 30-ish% to make, and with a reroll makes it about 47%, right? That's a coin flip that I'm probably winning, and if he fails and he loses the coin flip, everything in the middle of the board is going to be dead. But it was a 7-inch charge with a reroll that he had access to for both his Terminators that were in the open and the Lion, which stepped out of the Forest Realm or whatever it is that they have in the new lore. And he rolled with the Lion a 7-inch charge in order to get into my Rogel Dorn battle tank. And I know that Rogel Dorn is tanky. Toughness 9, 17 wounds to up save. It is not tanky enough to survive in Angry Primarch charging at it. And he chopped it to bits. And at that point, the game was mostly kind of over, right? On the next turn, he got his Terminators into my backline. They ended up tagging my command squad and my mortars and my tank commander. I didn't have a whole lot left on the board. And the only other cool thing that really happened was Lord Solar, for the third time this game, he had charged a commander in a crisis battle suit in game 1. He had charged Vashtor the Archifane in game 2. And in game 3, he charged Lionel Johnson, the Lion, and he killed every single one of those characters in melee. So, I mean, it was a bit of a cool morale victory coming out here for Lord Solar, but not enough to actually turn around the game. At that point, once I had basically run out of things on the board, we decided to talk out the game from there on about the bottom of turn 3. Partly because I was tired. It was a long day. I was already starting to feel a little bit scratchy in my throat, and I was like, all right, I'm tired. I've been playing a lot of Warhammer. I've been playing for like 9 hours. I only slept for like 5 hours the night before. We talked out. We agreed I would be able to max out, retrieve battlefield data, and get close to maxing out boots on the ground. It is worth noting, though, that because he killed so many of my officers on turn 3, I would only actually get to 10 points on Inflexible Command, which is, I think, the worst I've ever done on that secondary. But Kevin did end up taking it 97 to 76. And Kevin would go on to get second in the event. Only coming behind, his name was Joel. He brought Necrons, who got perfect 100. Joel went 116, 123, and then like 126 or something over the course of the day. Like, he blasted all of his opponents, including Jason McKenzie, the current number 2 on the ITC leaderboard. But either way, congratulations to Kevin. And as we start getting into it, for anybody who's just tuning in and just wants the brief overview of what happened, I played 3 games at this Gameology RTT. The first one, I ended up playing against Mark and his Tau. I ended up winning that one 88 to 62. The second game, I played up against Kyle Cornhub Norman and his Chaos Space Marines, the Cogs of Vashtor. I won that one very dominantly, 95 to 51. And in the third game, I ended up losing to Kevin and his Dark Angels with a score of 76 to 97. But the way that tiebreakers work and the way that everything works at ITC events is you score based on, firstly, your actual record. So, anybody who gets a 3-0 will do better than 2-1. But anybody with the same record will earn their spot based on the number of points that they had accrued over the course of the day. And at the end of it, I end up having 259 points that I had scored over the course of the entire day, which earned me fifth. Taking the 5th place by a margin of a single point over Camden Holt, who is also one of the top 100 players in the ITC leaderboards. And I only lost to people who had a 3-0 record, and there were four of them that ended up happening at this event. So congratulations to the top four. I ended up getting fifth in a crazy, crazy Shark Tank that I'm still very happy about. And overall, so my thoughts on the day. I would go again. I would really ask the Gameology to be able to turn on the air conditioning because it was definitely sweltering for a large part of the day. But I didn't get to play against any of the top 100 players like I wanted to. But realistically, I was still able to play up against three players who were effectively top 1,000. Mark Farrick was ranked about 300, and both Kyle and Kevin were about, in the top 1,000 players as well. So I got to play up against some pretty darn good players. I was able to hold my own. I won two games relatively non-interactively, and then the one game that did have a lot of interaction, I feel like if I had played that again, knowing what I know now, I don't know that I win it, but I actually give Kevin a really close game and have an opportunity to take top four at the event based on how many points I actually end up scoring. So it was a really good game, a really good day overall. And I also want to thank Kevin in particular because he gave me some of the best advice I think I've heard in general. I've asked a lot of people, just kind of like after every single game, I will ask them, was there anything that I did that was kind of dumb that you were like, oh, that's a relief. I'm glad you did that instead of doing X, Y, and Z. And for him, he said that I had used my Sentinels, which I had had a lot of success with, going up against Mark's Tau by just charging them into the back line. I was never going to be doing a whole lot with my Sentinels against Kevin's Dark Angels. But what I could do is I could have given them objective secured and just plop them onto the middle objective and deny 5 points from Kevin that way, which I hadn't ever really thought about. I was so focused on what, this really cool alpha strike that I do with the Sentinels that didn't end up coming through. The other thing that he told me was the mortars, after they had shot off Kevin's servitors and were no longer under threat of getting blasted off the table by his Desolation Marines, I should just use them to screen, right? Like, they're not going to be doing any real damage. I remember shooting all 9 mortars into one of his units in Terminator armor, and with 9d6 shots, they did one damage after all of his 2-up saves. So, they probably should have done like 2 damage, but still, like, not a whole lot of damage realistically coming through from those mortars afterwards. I should be using them to screen out the rest of my army. I should recognize that they are um, no longer key parts of my force because they've already done their job. And so being able to think about units like what is their job, how can they score me points, how can they prevent my opponents from scoring points, and what can I do with them after that, I think will really help me level up my game. So with that, again, on my journey to try and being a top 100 ITC player globally, after I get the points added from the Gameology RTT into the database, I'm expecting I'll probably be sitting somewhere around the top 7 or 800. So we will see exactly how that ends up coming about and what I can do to try and find my way up into the upper echelon. The next event that we actually have coming up is going to be the Odyssey Games RTT, which is going to be happening this upcoming Saturday. So be sure to tune into that, and we will make sure to keep everybody updated with the rest of this journey. So everybody who has tuned in so far, thank you so much for tuning into Joshi's Journey episode 2, and we'll see you guys all next week.